Today, we're ranking every fighter aircraft of WW2, from the flying machine that killed their own men's to the legendary warbirds that changed aerial combat forever. And trust me, the #1 spot might not be the fighter you're expecting.
15.
Brewster Buffalo, USA. Now, here's a plane that looked like the future and became a symbol of everything that can go wrong when a good idea meets a changing world. The Brewster Buffalo was actually America's first monoplane carrier fighter. In 1939, when it entered service, it was competitive, reasonably fast, reasonably armed. The Finnish Air Force flew it against the Soviets and loved it, using the Buffalo to rack up kill ratios that defied belief. But the Pacific theater was a different world entirely. When American and British pilots flew the Buffalo against Japanese Zeros over Malaya and the Dutch East Indies in 1941 and 42, the results were catastrophic. The Zero was lighter, faster, and turned tighter than anything the Allied pilots had trained to fight. The Buffalo, meanwhile, had been loaded up with extra armor, radios, and equipment, all of which made it slower and heavier than its specs promised. British pilots flying Buffaloes in the defense of Singapore described it as being trapped in a slow, stubborn box while Zeros danced around them. One RAF report didn't mince words, calling it totally inadequate for combat. The men flying these machines weren't inferior pilots. They were brave, trained, and experienced. They were just handed the wrong tool for the job, and in aerial combat, there's very little margin for that mistake. The Buffalo story isn't really about a bad plane. It's about the brutal speed at which warfare evolves, and what happens to the men caught in the gap between yesterday's technology and today's enemy.
14.
Hawker Hurricane, battle-tested defender. Here's something they don't teach you in school. The Battle of Britain was not won by the Spitfire. Oh, the Spitfire gets the glory, the posters, the movies, the museum exhibits. But during those desperate summer months of 1940, it was the Hurricane that did the heavy lifting. The Hurricane was older, slower, less glamorous. Fabric-covered fuselage where the Spitfire had sleek aluminum, thicker wings, less responsive at altitude. In a straight fight against a Messerschmitt BF 109, it was at a disadvantage. The RAF knew this, so they made a tactical decision. Send the Spitfires after the 109 escorts and send the Hurricanes after the bombers, the lumbering Heinkels and Dorniers that were flattening London. And the Hurricane was perfect for that. Stable, tough, and armed with 8 Browning machine guns that could tear a Heinkel apart. It was never the fastest or the most advanced, but at the moment Britain needed a fighter that could show up, take punishment, and keep flying, the Hurricane showed up.
13.
Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, USA. Nobody ever called the P-40 the best fighter of the war. Nobody wrote poems about it. It wasn't the fastest. It wasn't the most elegant. But if you want to understand what actually won World War II, not the glamour, but the grind, you need to understand the P-40 Warhawk. It was tough, brutally, almost stubbornly tough. Where the Zero sacrificed protection for performance, the P-40 was the opposite. Pilots took hits that would have turned other planes into fireballs and nursed their Warhawks home. It was also available. The P-40 was in production and ready for export when the war began in ways that more advanced designs weren't. Britain flew it, Australia flew it, the Soviet Union flew it, thousands of them on the brutal Eastern Front. And then there was the Flying Tigers. Claire Chennault's American volunteer group flew shark-mouth P-40s over China before America even formally entered the war. Fighting against the Zero, that mythological killer, Chennault devised tactics that played to the P-40's strengths. Diving attacks, hit and run, never turning, always converting speed into altitude and back again. His pilots achieved kill ratios that stunned the world. The P-40 deserves its place in this list not for being extraordinary, but for being exactly what was needed, exactly when it was needed, and reliable enough to be flown by men who were still learning what survival looked like. In war, showing up matters. The P-40 always showed up.
12.
Mitsubishi A6M Zero, agile early war predator. In 1940, the Zero was a ghost. Pilots who faced it in the early Pacific couldn't believe what they were seeing. A Japanese fighter that outturned, outclimbed, and outranged anything the Allies had. For a brief, terrifying stretch, it seemed invincible. But the Zero was built on a lie, or rather, a trade-off so severe it bordered on a death sentence for its own pilots. To achieve that extraordinary range and agility, Mitsubishi's engineers stripped out almost everything that might save a man's life. No armor plate behind the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks. The aircraft that looked like a Predator was structurally made of paper. When Allied pilots learned not to dogfight it, when they learned to dive, hit, and climb away, the Zero had no answer. It couldn't dive at high speeds without the controls locking up. It couldn't absorb punishment. One good burst, and it burned. By 1943, it was obsolete. By 1945, it was a coffin with wings being pointed at Allied ships in kamikaze attacks. A legendary beginning, a horrifying end.
11,
Lockheed P-38 Lightning, Twin Boom Sky Hunter. Look at a photograph of the P-38 and you'll do a double take. 2 booms, twin engines, a central pod for the pilot hanging in the middle like something out of science fiction. In 1937, when Lockheed unveiled the design, people genuinely didn't know what to make of it. They figured it out fast. The P-38 was the only American fighter in continuous production from the day America entered the war to the day it ended. It was the aircraft that hunted down and killed Admiral Yamamoto, the man who planned Pearl Harbor, intercepting his transport over the Pacific after American codebreakers cracked the Japanese communications. That mission alone would earn the P-38 its place in history. What held it back was the cockpit. In European winters at high altitude, it was freezing. The heating system was unreliable. Pilots came back with frostbite. It also had compressibility problems in steep dives. The controls would go nearly rigid, a problem Lockheed only partially solved. In the Pacific, where the altitude limitations mattered less, it was lethal. In Europe, it was outshone by what was coming.
10. The Yakovlev Yak-3. Picture this. It's late 1944, and a German pilot radios back to base. Beware of Yak fighters without an oil cooler under the nose. That wasn't a technical report. That was fear. The Yak-3 was the Soviet answer to a brutal question. How do you build the best low-altitude dogfighter on the planet with almost no raw materials? The answer was ruthless simplicity. Strip everything out. Keep it light. Make it fast. Under 13,000 feet, this little plane could outturn, outclimb, and outrun almost anything the Luftwaffe threw at it. German veterans, men who'd been flying since Poland in 1939, called it the most dangerous opponent they'd faced. Not because it was the most powerful, because it was perfectly suited to where most of the fighting actually happened. It was a surgical knife in a war full of sledgehammers.
9. The Lavochkin La-7. Now, if the Yak-3 was a knife, the La-7 was a sword. Where the Yak was built for agility, the La-7 was built for the complete package. Better armament, better high-altitude performance, better range, and it was still blindingly fast. This was the plane flown by Ivan Koshedub, the top Allied ace of the entire war, with 64 confirmed kills. 64! And he didn't achieve that by being lucky. He achieved it because the La-7 gave him an aircraft that could go anywhere in the sky and win. Here's what puts the La-7 one step above the Yak-3 on our list: versatility. The Yak-3 was a specialist. The La-7 was a champion across the board: climb rate, firepower, durability, and pilot survivability. It wasn't just better in one dimension, it was better in most of them. If the Yak-3 proved the Soviets could build world-class fighters, the La-7 proved they could build the best. 8. Focke-Wulf FW-190, brutal but deadly. September 1941. RAF pilots flying Spitfire Mark Vs over the English Channel start encountering something they've never seen before: a radial engine fighter, wide and brutal-looking, that is faster, rolls better, and hits harder than anything they're flying. The Focke-Wulf FW-190. It was such a shock that the RAF suspected, briefly, that they had captured Spitfires that the Germans had reverse-engineered. They hadn't. Kurt Tank, the designer, had simply built something genuinely superior. The FW-190 was heavier than the 109, but faster in a dive. It had a wider undercarriage, which meant it actually landed safely. The cockpit was modern and practical. The firepower, 4 20mm cannons plus 2 machine guns in some variants, was devastating. And unlike a lot of fighters, it was a pleasure to fly at low altitude, which made it equally effective as a ground attack aircraft. The Allies scrambled to respond. It pushed the RAF to rush the Spitfire Mark 9 into service ahead of schedule. That's how good the FW-190 was. It forced its enemies to accelerate their own evolution.
7,
Messerschmitt BF 109, Luftwaffe's reliable killer. If the Hurricane is the underdog, the BF 109 is the machine. Clinical, purposeful, built without sentiment. When it rolled out in the mid-1930s, it was arguably the finest fighter on Earth, and it remained dangerous right up until the last day of the war. Over 33,000 were produced, more than any other fighter in history. It flew on every front Germany touched: Spain, Poland, France, Britain, North Africa, the Eastern Front. The top-scoring fighter races of all time flew 109s. Men like Erich Hartmann, who accumulated 352 confirmed kills, a number so staggering it sounds like a misprint, did it almost exclusively in the cockpit of a 109.
But it had problems. The narrow undercarriage made it treacherous to land. Pilots called it a ground looper because it would veer violently on takeoff and landing. The cockpit was cramped. The canopy was difficult to jettison in an emergency. And as the war dragged on and Allied fighters improved, the 109 was never quite fast enough or quite long-ranged enough to dominate the way it once had. A great fighter, just not the greatest.
6.
Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, flying tank beast. The P-47 Thunderbolt was, by any reasonable measure, absurd. It weighed more than 7 tons fully loaded. It was the largest single-engine fighter of the war. Pilots who had been flying lighter planes climbed into the cockpit and felt like they were sitting inside a tank, which, in a way, they were. The Thunderbolt could absorb punishment that would have destroyed lesser aircraft. Stories circulated of P-47s returning to base with entire cylinders shot away, hydraulic systems failing, half a wing missing, and still landing. The radial engine was a fortress, and at high altitude, where its turbo-supercharged engine finally got into its stride, it was one of the fastest aircraft in the sky. Where it fell short was range. Early in the war, it couldn't escort bombers all the way to Germany and back. That limitation cost lives. Bomber crews called the gap in coverage the death zone. But when drop tanks finally extended its range, and when commanders realized it was also a supreme ground attack platform, able to carry bombs, rockets, and enough ammunition to obliterate entire convoys, the Thunderbolt became one of the most feared weapons of the European theater. Not elegant, devastating.
5.
Supermarine Spitfire, Britain's elegant legend. There is a moment in the design of the Spitfire that tells you everything. Reginald Mitchell, the engineer who created it, was dying of cancer while he drew the final plans. Mitchell died in June 1937, just 1 year after the Spitfire's first flight. He did not see it enter into squadron service. But he knew what he was building, and he built it with an almost obsessive perfectionism that you can still see in the aircraft's elliptical wings. Those curves so precisely calculated, they were extraordinarily difficult and expensive to manufacture. The Spitfire was fast from the moment it flew in 1936, and it kept getting faster. The Mark I of the Battle of Britain became the Mark V, then the Mark IX that countered the FW190, then the Mark XIV with the Griffin engine that could exceed 450 miles per hour. No other aircraft in the war was developed so continuously, so successfully, across so many variants. It was a platform that grew with the conflict. To fly it was, by all accounts, a physical sensation unlike anything else. The controls were so balanced, so responsive, that experienced pilots described it as an extension of their own body rather than a machine. It asked a great deal of its pilot. It was unforgiving of mistakes, but for those who mastered it, it was a partnership. 4 spots from the top, which tells you something about the top 4.
4.
Vought F4U Corsair, naval power icon. The Japanese called it whistling death. The sound of the Corsair's distinctive gull wings cutting through Pacific air apparently carried a specific recognizable frequency, and the pilots who heard it coming knew what it meant. The nickname was not affectionate. The Corsair was originally rejected by the U.S. Navy for carrier operations. Its long nose blocked the pilot's view on approach. It bounced on landing. It had a vicious torque stall if you weren't careful. The Navy gave it to the Marines instead, who operated it from land bases, and discovered that from those bases, it was almost impossibly effective, an 11-to-1 kill ratio against Japanese opposition across the Pacific theater. The British, who received Corsairs under Lend-Lease, actually figured out how to solve the carrier problem, a slight modification to the landing approach angle, and successfully flew them from carrier decks before the Americans did. The aircraft that America's own Navy had rejected as too difficult was being used by Britain as a frontline carrier fighter. Eventually, the Americans caught up. By the end of the war, it was flying strikes against the Japanese home islands. It would go on to fly in Korea, a fighter that outlasted the war it was born for.
3.
Grumman F6F Hellcat, Carrier Killer King. The story of the Hellcat begins with a crashed Zero. In June 1942, a Japanese pilot made a forced landing on a remote Alaskan island during the Battle of Dutch Harbor. He died in the crash, but the aircraft was largely intact, and the Americans recovered it. For the first time, engineers could take apart a Zero, study every rivet, weigh every component, measure every control surface. Grumman was already developing the F6F. They used what they learned from that Zero to refine it. More armor, self-sealing tanks, a powerful Pratt & Whitney engine that could handle the Zero's altitude range. The result was an aircraft specifically engineered to kill the Zero, and it did so at a ratio of 19-to-1 across the Pacific War. 19 Japanese aircraft for every Hellcat lost in air-to-air combat. It wasn't the prettiest fighter in the war. Grumman's aircraft always looked slightly industrial, like something built for function rather than aesthetics, which is exactly what they were. Pilots loved it because it kept them alive. It was stable, it was powerful, it was forgiving, and it hit back hard. By the time of the Mariana Islands campaign in 1944, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the Hellcat had essentially broken Japanese naval aviation as a fighting force. It ended the war with more aerial kills than any other Allied naval aircraft.
2,
North American P-51 Mustang, Ultimate Sky Champion. In the autumn of 1943, the American 8th Air Force was losing the war over Germany. Bomber crews on long-range raids to targets like Schweinfurt were suffering losses of 20–25% per mission. At that rate, statistically, you were dead before you finished your tour. Morale was collapsing. Commanders were considering whether strategic daylight bombing was even viable. Then, in December 1943, P-51 Mustangs appeared over Berlin for the first time. German pilots seeing them reportedly didn't believe it. A single-engine American fighter over Berlin. It wasn't possible. The range wasn't supposed to exist. And yet there they were, with drop tanks that could carry enough fuel to escort bombers all the way to the target and all the way home. The Mustang had an unlikely origin. It was designed and built in 117 days, a story that still seems implausible. Initially with an Allison engine that limited it to low altitudes. Then someone married the airframe to a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same engine that powered the Spitfire, and something extraordinary happened. The combination produced a fighter that was faster than almost anything Germany had a range of over 1,400 miles with drop tanks, and could hold its own in a turning fight at any altitude. Its kill ratio in Europe was better than 9-to-1. It escorted over 200,000 bomber sorties. It destroyed German air power not just in the sky, but on the ground, strafing Luftwaffe airfields, fuel depots, rail lines. By the time Germany surrendered, the Luftwaffe had been bled white, and a significant portion of that bleeding had been done by the P-51 Mustang. General Eisenhower called it the aircraft that won the war in Europe. That's not a line you find in a press release. That's a commander summing up, with no need to exaggerate, what he watched happen.
1,
The best. Messerschmitt Me-262, Germany, #1. Not because it won. It didn't. Not because it saved its country. It couldn't. The Messerschmitt Me-262 sits at the top of this list because it was, technologically, an aircraft that didn't belong in its era. It was a jet fighter, the world's first operational jet fighter, arriving in the middle of a war being fought by propeller-driven planes. Its two Junkers JMO turbojets pushed it to 560 miles per hour. That's 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51 Mustang. It climbed faster. It carried 4 30mm cannons that could tear a bomber apart in seconds. Allied pilots who encountered it described the experience in terms of shock, as if a machine from the future had suddenly appeared in their gun sights. And it had. The Me-262 should have been in the skies by 1942. The prototypes were ready. But a combination of factors, developmental delays, manufacturing problems, Hitler's insistence at one stage that it be used as a bomber rather than a fighter, meant it didn't enter serious combat operations until late 1944. By then, Germany was already losing the war on every front. Even so, Me-262 pilots achieved a kill ratio that defied the odds. Small units of these jets disrupted Allied air operations in ways that far greater numbers of conventional aircraft could not. What the Me-262 really represents is a glimpse through a doorway. The door to the future of aviation, the jet age, the supersonic age, the world every commercial passenger on every flight today still lives in. It was conceived in war, born too late to change the outcome of that war, and yet it changed everything that came after. The best aircraft of World War II, and the beginning of a world the men who flew it never quite lived to see fully arrive.
If you liked this video, I'm sure you'll like this one too. Subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Our channel is small, so we are replying every comment below. Comment any suggestion for future videos. Thanks for watching.